Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're looking at another 27-inch 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED gaming monitor, the MSI MAG 273QP X24. For some reason, MSI have 2 or even 3 of these 1440p 240Hz units on the market, one of the other ones that we've tested being the MAG 271QP X-E2, and there's very little difference between them, so I'm not entirely sure why MSI has made multiple models. My best guess is the newer X24 is slightly cheaper to produce while reusing the same panel from Samsung Display. This 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED panel is also very similar to 280 and 360Hz models that we've tested on the channel across the last 18 months. The only real difference with the 240Hz unit is the lower refresh rate. Outside of this, they're basically the same panel, with the lower refresh model typically shaving at least $100 US from the price compared to the 360Hz variants. The 273QP X24 has a very similar name to the 272QP X50 that we reviewed a couple of months ago, but it's important to be aware that these monitors use different panel types. The X24 is not simply a lower refresh version of the X50. The 500Hz X50 uses a newer QD-OLED panel with display HDR TrueBlack 500 certification, offering higher SDR and HDR brightness. Those capabilities are not available with the X24, which has TrueBlack 400 certification. While the X24's design is quite similar to other MSI OLED monitors, there are some small tweaks here which look to be an attempt to reduce the manufacturing cost. The rear panel uses a simpler black plastic construction, which I actually think looks better than MSI's more premium design used on the E2, for example. The standard connection is worse, now requiring screws rather than being fully toolless, but visually I quite like what MSI has done. The stand is pretty much the same as we've seen from MSI's 27-inch monitors for a while now. It has a somewhat flat squarish base, which is perfectly fine. The pillar is sturdy and supports height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment. For ports, we get one DisplayPort 1.4, which uses DSC for 10-bit 240Hz, and two HDMI 2.1 48GB per second ports. This is MSI's most basic port offering on a QD-OLED yet, omitting the USB-C input found on the E2 in another cost-saving move. There are no other USB ports either, so you don't get a hub or KVM switch functionality. However, firmware updates are still supported over DisplayPort. I updated this monitor to firmware FW.029 for this review. The OSD is controllable through a directional toggle under the MSI logo on the front. It's a relatively easy to navigate OSD that uses MSI's typical interface with their standard set of features. So we get a crosshair, refresh rate readout, sniper mode, shadow boosting, low blue light, and so on. Color controls are average and there's no black frame insertion support. Text clarity is the same as other 1440p QD-OLEDs, as this panel uses Samsung's revised triangle RGB subpixel layout. Compared to LCDs at the same size and resolution, QD-OLED isn't as strong for text rendering, as it produces some pink-green fringing at the top and bottom of text. This may or may not be noticeable depending on how sensitive you are to artifacts. In most comparisons, I found text clarity to be superior to similar WOLED panels, most of which use an RWBG subpixel layout. The exceptions to this are newer 480Hz and primary RGB tandem panels, which use a newer layout that produces more comparable results to QD-OLED. Overall, QD-OLED text rendering is perfectly fine for gaming and average to reasonable for occasional desktop usage. This QD-OLED panel is glossy, which is a double-edged sword. The main benefit is increased sharpness and clarity compared to matte coatings, with no coating grain or light diffusion that can impact apparent contrast. The downsides are mirror-like reflections, which are well managed on this panel compared to some glossy finishes, and QD-OLED ambient light reflection. In brighter environments, when displaying black, QD-OLED panels can appear grey instead, as ambient light activates the quantum dot layer. This reduces black depth in well-lit rooms and hurts the black level advantage you get from OLED, but the issue can be mitigated by ensuring your room is dimly lit with light sources behind the display. Whether QD-OLED glossy is the right choice for you is dependent on your personal preferences and usage conditions. OLED panels of all varieties are also susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burn-in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses, where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day. And you can check out our ongoing OLED burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a monitor for hours of work. MSI offer an industry-standard 3-year burn-in warranty. Response time performance is excellent on this QD-OLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark at all refresh rates, and performance doesn't change at lower refresh rates, one of the many benefits of OLED for variable refresh rate gamers. This results in a single overdrive mode experience where you don't need to adjust settings depending on the refresh rate you're using. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors, including WOLED variants. OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate, so 240Hz QD-OLEDs offer a similar experience to 360Hz LCDs. Aside from comparisons to LCDs, the main thing you need to be aware of when buying an OLED for motion is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look basically the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with a 240Hz max refresh and one with a 280Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120 FPS with a 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you use the highest refresh rate capabilities. Now that both 240 and 280Hz refresh rates are available at a similar price, it's important to compare the two, but really there isn't a huge difference when gaming at the maximum refresh rate. 280Hz is slightly clearer, but it's not a game changer or something I'd pay a premium for. Most gamers will be totally fine with 240Hz. However, to me at least, 360Hz is a noticeable upgrade over 240Hz when gaming above 240 FPS. So for those that like to play lots of fast-paced multiplayer games, there is a reason to grab something with a higher refresh rate. If you stick more to single-player titles at lower frame rates, then you may never use the capabilities of higher refresh rate models. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 1 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a decent refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use. The only way to achieve better latency is through a higher refresh rate model, for example 360Hz or one of the latest 500Hz options. Power consumption is pretty typical for a QD-OLED, consuming 66 watts for a full white image, which is slightly higher than the 271QP X24 and Dell AW2725D. For mostly white content, WOLED has an advantage due to its dedicated white subpixel. However, in a typical gaming session, the gap between QD-OLED and WOLED shrinks. I found all of 240Hz QD-OLED, 240Hz WOLED, and 280Hz QD-OLED to use roughly the same amount of power in this test, around that 30 watt mark. This is a little more than an LCD of the same size, but less than higher refresh rate OLEDs. All QD-OLEDs that we've tested so far offer a similar color space. In the case of the X24, we're looking at 99% DCI-P3 coverage and strong results for viewing HDR content or working in those color spaces. In total, I saw 80.4% coverage of Rec 2020, which is a good result for a QD-OLED monitor and gaming monitors in general. Factory calibration is decent, improving upon what MSI offered with the E2 model previously. The color temperature is pretty good by default, and the gamma is decent as well, leading to a good, though not perfect, grayscale Delta E result. Like with a lot of gaming monitors, the SDR mode does not use an sRGB or Rec 709 gamut clamp by default, so a lot of content will be oversaturated as it gets expanded up to fill the very wide gamut of this monitor. Some people like this effect, although it's not especially accurate and can cause issues with skin tones in YouTube videos, for example. Compared to other displays, the X24 and X50 offer similar factory calibration, with the Dell AW2725D slightly ahead. Color checker performance is a much of a muchness. The X24 works reasonably well with Windows 11 auto color management. MSI reports good color primaries to Windows, meaning that sRGB gamut emulation maintains 99% color space coverage. Saturation and color checker performance is much improved, but falls short of what I'd call strong factory calibration. It's a good option to consider if you still want to retain full OSD control, as the built-in sRGB mode locks settings like white balance. The sRGB mode is more accurate for SDR content and is the best way to use this monitor. Grayscale performance is improved compared to the default configuration, leading to a Delta E average below 5.0, and the same can be said for the color tests, so this is a good level of factory calibration. If we compare this to other monitors, the X24 has a better sRGB mode than the E2, and overall we get a solid result in grayscale, though not as good as the MO27Q2 from Gigabyte. Similar story in color checker, where the X24 puts up a pretty good result, though it's in the middle of the results seen. A full calibration can improve performance further, and we used CalMan for that. This panel is well suited to multiple color spaces, including DCI-P3 when fully calibrated. Peak SDR brightness is the same as other 240 to 360 Hz OLEDs at 250 nits. Despite being a newer product, this panel technology used here is from a generation prior to the new 500 Hz QD-OLEDs, which reach 300 nits, so that's why we're not seeing any brightness boost compared to other non-500 Hz QD-OLEDs. MSI do not use an automatic brightness limiter in the SDR mode, so brightness is a consistent 250 nits in all situations. This level of brightness should be fine for most people, though of course it's not as strong as LCDs for those who want to use their monitor in a bright room. Minimum brightness of 30 nits is excellent for use in darker rooms. I was very impressed with the viewing angles of this panel. They are very wide, which makes it easy to view the display even at quite extreme angles. It really looks excellent. Uniformity was also very good with my unit, nice and uniform viewing full white and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. This is keeping QD-OLED in the leadership position for display uniformity among OLEDs. The 273QP X50 is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including QD-OLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for a clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high-contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per pixel control, but zone backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of a monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. MSI are offering the usual QD-OLED experience with the X24's HDR configuration and modes. There's a True Black 400 mode and a Peak 1000 nits mode, the same as seen with the E2 model and many other MSI OLEDs. The latest firmware, released just a few weeks ago, does not include MSI's EOTF boost mode. The two main modes, True Black and Peak 1000, operate in the same way as other QD-OLED monitors. The True Black 400 mode is the most accurate and doesn't have panel dimming in brighter scenes, but peak brightness is capped at 450 nits. The Peak 1000 nit mode removes the brightness cap, and peak brightness now hits 1000 nits, but there is panel dimming in brighter, higher APL scenes, and this impacts accuracy. MSI do not offer a boosted brightness configuration, there's just these two options. The general accuracy in each of these configurations is pretty good, outside of the areas where the Peak 1000 mode has panel dimming. To be fair, panel dimming is a flaw with all QD-OLED panels, so you'll also find this problem on competing models. Basically, we're still in a position where you can't achieve the highest peak brightness in darker scenes without bizarrely dimming brighter scenes. For the best experience, you'll need to change HDR modes depending on whether you are playing mostly brighter or mostly darker content. Alternatively, you can set and forget the mode you're most interested in optimizing for. HDR brightness is identical to other QD-OLED monitors. In these charts, other monitors are listed using their brightest configuration, and you'll see basically no difference at various window sizes. In real scene brightness, the results are close to what we usually see. The True Black mode has no panel dimming, the Peak 1000 mode does. The True Black mode has higher brightness in mid to high APL content, but is capped to 450 nits. The Peak 1000 mode can reach over 900 nits in real-world scenes, but isn't as bright in higher APL scenes. In either case, we don't see performance as strong as the newest OLED panels. 500Hz QD-OLEDs that are certified to True Black 500 are brighter, especially for higher APL content, though panel dimming remains an issue. There's also primary RGB tandem WOLED panels, which are brighter across the board and don't have panel dimming issues. In either case, those displays are more expensive, so it's certainly a situation where you get an advantage from premium products. In terms of accuracy, the X24 has excellent dark scene accuracy in either configuration. Bright scene accuracy is good when using the true black mode with limited peak brightness, but is very inaccurate in the peak 1000 mode. Color match accuracy is mid-table, and color volume is identical to other QD-OLEDs we've tested. Lastly, we have the Hub Essentials checklist. MSI do a relatively good job of advertising this monitor, getting the brightness details spot on. Unfortunately, the name is too long and overall quite mediocre. X24 is easy to remember and a good short name for the product, though there's an IPS LCD that also uses it. If you just search for 273QP, you get a few different models. Surely there was a more simple and memorable name that could be used. As for the feature support matrix, this is very similar to most other QD-OLED monitors. The X24 doesn't support stuff like Dolby Vision and has a more limited port selection than the premium products, but most other stuff is included here. Overall, the MSI MAG 273QP X24 is a great QD-OLED gaming monitor, which we've become accustomed to from this panel type. As it's occasionally available for around $500 US, it presents decent value in the current market, though it's not necessarily a standout option given the wide range of OLEDs offering similar specs and performance. I think it's a little strange that MSI released the X24 when it wasn't that long ago that they released the MAG 271QP X-E2, which is essentially the same product. The X24 is better calibrated, but omits the USB-C input and opts for a slightly more basic design to save a small amount of money. MSI also offer the 271QP X24, which appears to be another variant using the same panel. Do we really need 3 monitors that are essentially the same? Just means there are more mediocre and confusing names to keep track of, and more monitors MSI needs to support through firmware updates and so on. Ignoring that for a moment though, the X24 is a great product. It takes Samsung Display's 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED panel and calibrates it well across the SDR and HDR modes. There's nothing special about how it performs, same brightness and HDR modes as other variants, but it's still a very good monitor panel that delivers a great gaming experience, fast response times, excellent contrast ratio, per pixel dimming, all the usual good stuff along with typical weaknesses like the screen coating. Whether or not the X24 is worth buying is largely dictated by the price, as there's very little separating this variant from others using the same panel, either in features or performance. $500 US, the current price listed on MSI's official store, is decent, and in that sort of range I'd probably recommend it. But right now it's out of stock at $500, with the next cheapest listings being over $600, which is nowhere near as good of a deal. There's a lot of products competing for attention in this price range that use very similar display hardware. One is the Dell Alienware AW2725D, which is actually a 280Hz variant, and it's available for just $530 US, down slightly from its $550 MSRP. There is no reason whatsoever to spend more money on the X24 than the AW2725D, and if the Dell model continues to be available for $530, the absolute maximum MSI can charge for their 240Hz model is $500. Even then, you could make a case that spending the extra $30 to get a slightly higher refresh rate is worth it. Pricing may not be favorable in other regions as well, so it pays to check all the options available to you. Right now in Australia, the MSI X24 is priced at $830, while the AW2725D is just $800. So again, it's a no-brainer to go for the Dell model. If pricing swings more in favour of the X24 though, it's a decent buy for sure. So anyway, that's it for this review of the MSI MAG 273QP X24, another 1440p QD-OLED, but as one of the cheapest options, I thought it was worth taking a look. If you do appreciate our independent testing and reviews, one of the best ways to support the channel is using the links in the description below to check pricing and purchase the monitor if you're interested in doing so after watching this review. Other than that, we also have our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. And if you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, like our monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, Discord chat, and plenty of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.